Welcome to episode 69 of Tales from the Hangman's Record. All the stories featured in these videos are taken from cases in my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record 1868 to 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles are available from my website stevefielding.com. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this presentation. Donations to help with the running costs are much appreciated and can be made by clicking thanks or using the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. Comments on whether you believe justice was done and suggestions for future episodes in this series and on my other channel, Crime Casebook, are always welcome. Softly, softly, catchy monkey. A proverb so intrinsically linked with the workings of a detective in the police force, it became the motto of Lancashire Constabulary's training school and even became the name of a long-running police series in the 1960s. Today's episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record is a great example of the patience and tenacity of Scotland Yard detectives hunting the brutal killer of a businessman in his lock-up garage on the south coast of England. The killer, using the cunning of a criminal with a record stretching back to before his teens, used a number of aliases and moved from city to city and job to job trying to cover his tracks. But it was those tiny clues the killer overlooked, combined with first-class police work along with skilled forensic investigation, that saw him finally make the 8 o'clock walk to the scaffold. Late on the evening of Thursday, the 10th of January 1929, the Chief Constable of Southampton Police sent an urgent telegram to Scotland Yard. A case of murder has occurred here. A man has been found shot in a room, the door of which was padlocked. The body was found today and has probably been in the room for 8 or 9 weeks. Will you please send an officer down to investigate the matter? It was not an unusual ask. Scotland Yard would promptly respond to requests for their services at no cost to the local force if they were asked at the start of the investigation. Within the hour, tasked with trying to solve the case, Chief Inspector John Podmore and Detective Sergeant Hugh Young were on a Hampshire-bound train steaming out of Waterloo. Arriving in the early hours, they were first taken to Bargate Police Station, where they rested until dawn, when they were taken to the mortuary to view the body and then onto the scene of crime. The body had been found beside the company car and it was believed he had been shot in the head. Visual identification was almost impossible, as the features were unrecognisable, partly through decomposition and with rats having feasted on the exposed parts of flesh on the face and hands. Fortunately, items found on the body would confirm his identity. Examining the car, they found a number of invoice books on the back seat and noticed that the ignition was turned on and the petrol tank empty. This suggested the car had been kept running, perhaps to muffle the sound of the murder, with the engine remaining ticking over until the fuel had run out. Detective Inspector Chatfield of Southampton CID brought the Scotland Yard men up to date with the facts as they were known. Prothero learned that earlier on that Thursday morning, Harry Passmore, an agent for the Wolf's Head Oil Company based in London, had been sent to 42 Grove Street, Southampton, to start to take over as their southern-based agent. The previous incumbent had seemingly locked up the premises back in October and vanished. His landlord had reported him missing to the police and an officer had called at the garage to investigate. Entering the yard by scaling the gate, he had climbed the steps and peering through a broken glass pane could see that the car was inside, the gate securely padlocked, and with nothing suspicious other than the missing man, it was assumed he had merely given up the business, locked the premises and gone. With the garage standing empty for over 6 weeks, the company had engaged Passmore to take over and instructed him to enter the garage and make a full stock take. With no keys to the heavy padlock securing the garage, he needed assistance from a local builder to force entry, and once inside, he surveyed his new premises. Podmore was soon attracted to a horrible smell that appeared to be coming from behind some oil drums, and it was as he made his way across the storeroom and moved a number of boxes that the mystery of the disappearance of the missing agent was solved, and the murder hunt was about to begin. It was after successfully running a number of businesses in America that much-travelled 58-year-old Vivian Messiter returned to his native England in September of 1928. Something of an enigma, Somerset-born Messiter was quiet, uncommunicative, and with few friends, had emigrated to the United States with his brother as a young man. They initially worked together breeding horses in New Mexico until the one-time student of medicine switched to engineering, and travelled to the East Coast. He found work in the construction of the subway tunnel under the River Hudson in New York. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, he immediately returned home to enlist. He was commissioned into the Northumberland Fusiliers, rising to the rank of captain. Whilst fighting in France, he was badly injured, being shot through both thighs, and was discharged from the army with an impressive record and a legacy of a wound that left him crippled and with a noticeable limp. Following the armistice, he returned to America, and it was a decade later that he decided to come back to England and start a new business. Messiter took up the post with the Wolf's Head Oil Company, based in Southampton, and took lodgings at 3 Carlton Road in the city. He secured the premises at 42 Grove Street and placed an advertisement in the local press for sub-agents to work for him. On Tuesday morning, the 30th of October 1928, Messiter, a man of regular habits and routine, rose at dawn and took an earlier breakfast than usual, telling his landlord, Albert Perrott, a former policeman, that he had an urgent appointment. He was never seen alive again. 2 days later, with his lodger having failed to return home, Perrott called at the garage on Grove Street, but found all the doors were locked and there was no sign of Vivian Messiter. The landlord had already surmised from conversations with Messiter that business was struggling, and assumed he had simply done a flit and walked away from it. He had reported the disappearance to the local police, and although an officer had checked over the premises, there seemed to be an extraordinary lack of interest in the whereabouts of Vivian Messiter. It was learned he had been divorced many years earlier, and there were a number of letters from America in his lodgings, but nobody other than the landlord seemed to have missed him. Then, with over a month having passed and with still no word from their southern agent, officers at Wolf's Head headquarters appointed the new agent, Harry Podmore, and the body of the missing man was discovered. Prothero and his team thoroughly examined the garage. He ordered all the boxes and oil drums to be carefully moved and every nook and cranny searched. Soon this turned up several important clues. The first was the discovery of a hammer lying against a wall behind the boxes. It was an unusual design and had filed down almost to a point at one end. When a picture appeared in the paper, a garage owner, based not far from the scene of the murder, told police he had loaned it to a stranger who had called into the workshop asking to borrow a hammer. It was never returned. He immediately recognised it as his and said that he had bought it in France, and could tell by the repairs to the shaft and the filings to the head that it was his property. The mechanic also told detectives that he may be able to identify the man if he was to see him again. Close examination of the hammer found traces of blood and human hair attached. This was significant. Although at first it appeared that Messiter had been shot in the head, Prothero had immediately requested the assistance of Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, and he was soon able to tell detectives that Messiter had not been shot, instead had been battered to death. The wounds were consistent with having been caused by a hammer. The search of the storeroom also revealed 2 tiny scraps of paper, caked in oil and dirt. Carefully examined, they found that one was a note from Messiter to a Mr. W.F. Thomas. A search of Messiter's room at his lodgings unearthed a letter, a reply to an advertisement that Messiter had placed, and was discovered bearing the name William F. Thomas, with an address at 5 Cranberry Avenue, Southampton. When detectives visited that address, they found that Thomas had left at the beginning of November. leaving a forward address in Chiswick that turned out to be false. The details they already had on Thomas were circulated in the Police Gazette and soon brought interesting results. Detectives in Wiltshire informed Prothero that they were looking for a man named Thomas in connection with the theft of some wage packets containing over £130 from a garage in Downton, near Salisbury, on Wednesday the 21st of December. Thomas had disappeared from his lodgings, which were checked by detectives in Wiltshire, and another scrap of paper was found, this time bearing the name Auto and Radio Services of London Road in Manchester. A phone call to the Manchester police brought no news of William Thomas in connection with the Auto and Radio Services, but they were looking for a former mechanic, William Henry Podmore, wanted on a charge of fraud and theft of a car and motorcycle. They were quickly able to determine that William Thomas and William Podmore was one and the same person, and that not only did he work in the motor trade, but he also had a long criminal record for a variety of offences. Born in Stoke-on-Trent in 1901, Podmore had been first convicted at the age of 10 for housebreaking and sent to Borstal. During a gang fight in his teens, he was attacked with a broken bottle, leaving him with a scar over his left eye. The police hunt for the man with the scar was how the press had labelled the hunt for the fugitive in the Southampton case. Podmore had served several terms of Borstal and imprisonment at Stafford, Knutsford and Leicester for a range of crimes like larceny, housebreaking and cheque-book fraud. In 1925, while serving briefly in the Lancashire Fusiliers and based at Bury Barracks, he began courting a barmaid named Mary Bibby. She then left her native Bury and moved to Warrington, and on his discharge from the army, Podmore followed her. Using the name Franklin Leno Nichols, the couple married in Warrington, but he deserted her by the time their daughter was born. At his lodgings in both Southampton and Downton, Podmore had been with a woman named Lily Hambleton. Dubbed in the press Golden-haired Lil, police traced her back to her home in Stoke. They learned that the couple had been employed at Ye Stonebridge Hotel in Warwickshire on a 3-month trial for wages of £2 a week. After less than a fortnight, Podmore had panicked after seeing his name in the papers, and sending Lil back to Stoke, had fled back down south. Lily Hambleton told detectives that she and Podmore often stayed at the Leicester Hotel on Vauxhall Bridge Road, London. When officers visited that address, they caught up with William Podmore, booked in under his own name. Podmore admitted being in Southampton on the 30th of October at Grove Street, but claimed he had left Messiter with another agent called Maxton or Baxton. Although he was strongly suspected as being the man wanted for the murder of Vivian Messiter, Prothero had as yet insufficient evidence to charge him, so he bided his time as Podmore was transferred to Manchester to face the charges of theft and fraud. At Manchester Assizes, he was sentenced to 2 terms of 3 months and sent to the city's Strangeways jail to serve his sentence. Just a few weeks in, Podmore was taken by train down to Winchester prison, where he was remanded while the inquest into the murder of Vivian Messiter took place. He was then returned to Manchester and, at the end of his sentence, as he stepped out of the prison gates, was immediately rearrested by officers from Wiltshire and charged with the wages theft at Downton. Podmore stood trial for this at the Central Criminal Court in London, where he received a further 6-month sentence for the theft to be served at Wandsworth Prison. All the while, the Scotland Yard men were slowly building their case on the charge of murder, and a breakthrough came when Prothero examined closely the receipt book for the oil sale commissions. He noticed that there was an indentation on one of the pages from the page above, which had been torn out, which was able to show was for a sale dated the 28th of October, 2 days before Messiter disappeared. The receipt was signed WFT and suggested that Podmore, using the alias Thomas, had been claiming commission for bogus sales, and he removed the incriminating pages in the hope of avoiding detection. Why else would anybody remove the pages unless they were trying to conceal a crime? Prothero pondered with his team. The case against Podmore was built on the belief that upon learning that the new agent had been making fraudulent claims, Messiter had confronted him. Being aware of the Manchester charge and the likelihood of further imprisonment, Podmore had panicked and murdered Messiter by striking him with the hammer. Satisfied that they had enough evidence to go to trial, on a cold December morning in 1929, over a year since the murder had taken place, Prothero and Young were waiting as Podmore stepped out of Wandsworth Prison. No sooner had the gates closed behind him, Sergeant Young appeared next to him and before Podmore could resist, snapped handcuffs onto the suspect, telling him he was under arrest for murder. As the detectives bundled the prisoner into the back of the police car, with Detective Sergeant Young by his side, Inspector Prothero took his seat beside the driver and they set off towards Winchester. As they made their way towards Hampshire, there was an incident probably unique in the annals of true crime. Reaching a fork in the road, the detectives began to discuss the best route. From the back, Podmore told them that they needed to turn left, while the police driver was adamant it was right. After a short argument, Podmore finally said, "Luke, whenever I steal a car from London and take it back to Southampton to sell, I take the fork to the left." As the car pulled up at the side of the road, Prothero noticed that they were being followed. Taking Podmore's directions, they hadn't travelled more than a few miles further on the road when the police car suddenly ground to a halt. The driver made a number of attempts to restart it, before Podmore reminded him he was a motor mechanic and if they would remove the handcuffs, he would try to fix it. As he did so, the car Prothero believed was following them pulled up behind. It belonged to Norman Ray, at the time a reporter on the London Standard, but destined to become the celebrated crime journalist on the News of the World. Ray watched as Podmore, in his shirt sleeves, got to work fixing the car that was taking him to Winchester jail and almost certain execution. Being a seasoned jailbird, Podmore, when he heard he was being tried at Hampshire, was so confident of being acquitted that he boasted to fellow inmates at Wandsworth, "The old farmers at Hampshire don't know how to try a man." In due course, on Monday, the 3rd of March, William Podmore stood trial in Winchester before the Lord Chief Justice Gordon Hewitt, charged with wilful murder. Former Attorney General Sir Thomas Inskip KC led for the Crown, with Podmore's defence handled by Mr Hubert de Park KC. Prosecution's case was in the main circumstantial, and relied much on the evidence of 3 cellmates to whom Podmore was alleged to have confessed while in both Winchester and Wandsworth. The defence dismissed these testimonies as tainted, claiming the prisoners were not credible witnesses. Mr de Park also pointed out that at an identity parade amongst a dozen men, the man who had loaned the hammer, the alleged murder weapon, failed to pick him out. He denied there was any link between the defendants and the hammer and claimed that Podmore had left the oil company on good terms, telling Messiter the job had not suited him and that he had found a more suitable one in Downton. Inskip for the prosecution claimed that Podmore had willingly admitted to the Manchester and Downton crimes, as he felt it was safer for him to be in prison and hopefully out of the frame as Prothero and his team searched for the killer. But it was the scraps of screwed up oily paper and the pages torn from the receipt book that only the killer would benefit from destroying that was to seal Podmore's fate. They were all parts of the evidence that Prothero had gathered together and fitted like pieces of a jigsaw to build an overwhelming case against the accused. On the 6th day of the trial, following a summing up by Lord Chief Justice Hewitt, heavily biased against the prisoner, the jury needed just 83 minutes to find William Podmore guilty, and he was sentenced to death. There was no recommendation for mercy. An appeal was immediately launched and later held before Justices Avery, Finlay and Branson. They could find no flaw in the evidence, and speaking to the trial judge, he stated that the evidence was utterly and absolutely clear. As he sat in the condemned cell at Winchester, a story appeared in the press that the Labour Home Secretary John Clines, had received a visitation from a ghostly figure, claiming he knew something about the case. Clines had publicly declared his belief that capital punishment was merely a form of revenge and that he was against it, but insisted that while he was in office, it was his duty to carry out the law and not give way to personal feelings. Shortly before the execution of William Podmore, Clines had cut short his holiday to be in London in case any new evidence came to light, and was spending the night reading quietly at home. Suddenly there was a hollow-sounding knock on his front door, and answering it, Clines saw what he described as a dim figure, coarsely bearded, looking like an apparition from the grave. "I have come to speak to you about the hammer used in the Podmore case," he said in a gentle voice. Clines replied it would be improper to discuss such a matter in private, but that he would do so at the Home Office on the following morning. "I cannot come then," the man replied, and he went away and never turned up again. Podmore's estranged wife, who had deserted 4 years earlier, visited him in the condemned cell and made strenuous efforts to help secure a reprieve and organise a petition which gathered thousands of signatures. A few days before he was to hang, Podmore's mother contacted a newspaper and said that a spiritualist had told her that during a séance, Messiter had said to her, "Podmore did not kill me, he was one of my best servants. If they hang him, they will hang an innocent man." This was all to no avail, and William Podmore was hanged by Tom Pierpoint and Alfred Allen on Tuesday the 22nd of April 1930. He refused his last breakfast but smoked several cigarettes and accepted a toss of brandy before walking the 6 steps from the cell to the scaffold without a trace of emotion. A large crowd assembled outside the prison to wait for notices to be posted that William Podmore had been hanged. He was one of just 4 men to be executed that year, which featured a much higher series of reprieves than normal as Parliament debated whether to abolish the death penalty. A year later, Mary Podmore remarried, this time to an out-of-work circus showman, telling reporters she was glad to be rid of the Podmore name and the shame it brought her and her daughter. As with her first marriage, this lasted only a matter of weeks, before her husband walked out of their Warrington home and returned to Rochdale. She later took him to court for desertion and failing to pay maintenance. The annals of true crime are full of criminals who almost got away with it. That one small, seemingly insignificant scrap of paper dropped on the floor after carrying out the crime, that in the hands of a skilled detective and forensic science was enough to put the suspect in the dock and face the hangman one spring morning over a year later. You'll be watching another tale from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.